The gunshots that echoed across Devil's Canyon that morning weren't aimed at bandits or outlaws. They were aimed at Samuel Garrett, the stagecoach driver whose only crime was losing passengers. But as the smoke cleared and the federal agents lay defeated, the people of Colorado Territory finally understood why Samuel's empty stagecoach had been the most important vehicle in the fight for freedom. Samuel Garrett had been driving the Mountain View Express route between Denver and Santa Fe for 8 years, and in all that time, he had never successfully delivered a single passenger to their intended destination. Every Monday morning, he would arrive at the Denver station with his 4-horse team perfectly groomed and his red stagecoach polished to a shine. Passengers would climb aboard with their tickets and luggage, waving goodbye to family and friends as Samuel cracked his whip and started the 3-day journey south through some of the most beautiful and dangerous territory in Colorado. But when Samuel's stagecoach rolled into Santa Fe every Thursday evening, it would be completely empty. No passengers, no luggage, no explanation for where everyone had gone. Samuel would simply tip his hat to the station manager, collect his pay, and prepare for the return journey north, as if losing an entire coach full of people was the most natural thing in the world. At 45 years old, Samuel was exactly what people expected from a frontier stagecoach driver. He was tall and lean from years of outdoor work, with weathered hands that could handle the most stubborn horses and sharp eyes that could spot trouble on the trail miles before it became dangerous. His voice was calm and reassuring, the kind of voice that could keep passengers steady during river crossings or mountain storms. Children loved him, horses trusted him, and even the most nervous travelers felt safe when Samuel was handling the reins. What made Samuel's situation so baffling was that he was otherwise the most reliable driver on the entire Mountain View Express line. He had never been late for a departure, never missed a scheduled stop, and never lost so much as a piece of mail or cargo. His coaches were always clean and well-maintained. His horses were the healthiest on the route, and his knowledge of Colorado Territory's trails and roads was unmatched. The only thing Samuel couldn't seem to do was keep track of his passengers. The pattern had been consistent from his very first week on the job. Passengers would board in Denver, full of excitement about their journey and their destinations in Santa Fe. Samuel would drive them out of the city, making the usual stops for meals and overnight rest at way stations along the route. But somewhere between Denver and Santa Fe, usually during the second day of travel, the passengers would simply vanish without a trace. Samuel's explanations for these disappearances were always the same. The passengers had decided to leave the coach at one of the way stations and continue their journeys by other means. When pressed for details, Samuel would shrug and say that people changed their mind about travel all the time, especially when they realized how difficult and dangerous the mountain routes could be. He claimed that he always offered to refund their fares, but that most passengers preferred to forfeit their money rather than continue with the stagecoach journey. The Mountain View Express Company had investigated Samuel's claims by sending supervisors to check with way station operators along the route. But none of the station managers reported seeing Samuel's missing passengers. No one remembered groups of travelers suddenly deciding to abandon their journeys halfway to Santa Fe. Most puzzling of all, no alternative transportation services reported picking up stranded passengers along Samuel's route. Despite the mystery surrounding his missing passengers, Samuel remained employed because he was otherwise such an excellent driver and because the Mountain View Express was having difficulty finding qualified replacements. Stagecoach driving was dangerous work that required specialized skills, and experienced drivers were rare on the frontier. The company decided that it was better to employ a driver who lost passengers than to have no driver at all. But Samuel's passenger disappearances were beginning to attract attention from law enforcement agencies that were concerned about the safety of travelers in Colorado Territory. Federal marshals who were responsible for investigating crimes against interstate travelers had received complaints from families whose relatives had boarded Samuel's stagecoach and were never seen again. Marshal David Kane, who specialized in investigating transportation crimes, was assigned to determine what was happening to Samuel's missing passengers. Kane was an experienced investigator who had dealt with stagecoach robberies, attacks by hostile Native American tribes, and various criminal schemes that targeted travelers. But the Samuel Garrett case was unlike anything he had encountered before. Kane's initial investigation focused on the possibility that Samuel was working with bandits who were robbing and murdering his passengers. This was a common criminal scheme on frontier transportation routes, where drivers would provide inside information to robbers about which coaches were carrying valuable cargo or wealthy passengers. But Kane's investigation revealed no evidence of robbery or violence along Samuel's route. No bodies were found, no personal belongings were discovered, and no reports of attacks were filed by way station operators. Kane's next theory was that Samuel was involved in some kind of kidnapping operation, perhaps selling passengers into slavery or forced labor. But this explanation also failed to match the evidence. The passengers who disappeared from Samuel's coach came from all social and economic backgrounds, making them unlikely targets for systematic kidnapping. Moreover, no ransom demands were ever made, and no slaves matching the descriptions of missing passengers were found in markets throughout the territory. The breakthrough in Kane's investigation came when he decided to pose as a passenger on Samuel's stagecoach, hoping to discover firsthand what was happening to the people who boarded the Mountain View Express but never reached their destinations. Kane purchased a ticket for the Monday morning departure from Denver, presenting himself as a traveling merchant interested in establishing business connections in Santa Fe. He carried legitimate merchandise samples and business documents that would support his cover story, and he dressed in the simple clothes of a middle-class businessman seeking new opportunities in the frontier territories. Samuel greeted Kane with the same warm professionalism he showed to all his passengers, helping him load his luggage and ensuring that he was comfortably seated for the journey ahead. The other passengers on that Monday morning included a young woman traveling to meet her fiancé, an elderly man visiting family, and a couple seeking new farmland in New Mexico territory. The first day of travel proceeded exactly as Kane had expected from his research on Samuel's route. They made scheduled stops for meals and rest, spent the night at a way station operated by a family that had been serving travelers for more than a decade, and resumed their journey the following morning without incident. Samuel was attentive to his passengers' needs, knowledgeable about the territory they were crossing, and completely professional in his conduct. But on the second day of travel, Kane began to notice unusual aspects of Samuel's route that hadn't been apparent from his earlier investigation. Rather than following the main trail that connected way stations and trading posts, Samuel was taking detours through remote canyon areas that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. When passengers asked about these diversions, Samuel explained that he was avoiding areas where recent rains had made the roads impassable or where hostile Indians had been reported. Kane's military training had taught him to pay attention to terrain and navigation, and he quickly realized that Samuel's explanations for his route changes didn't match the actual conditions they were encountering. The weather had been dry for weeks, making Samuel's claims about muddy roads implausible. More importantly, the remote areas where Samuel was driving seemed more likely to encounter hostile Indians than the main travel routes that were regularly patrolled by military units. Kane's suspicions were confirmed when Samuel guided the stagecoach into a narrow canyon that was clearly a dead end. The driver claimed that he needed to water the horses at a spring that was located at the far end of the canyon, but Kane could see that there was no spring ahead and no way to turn the large stagecoach around once they reached the canyon's end. What Kane discovered in that canyon would change everything he thought he knew about Samuel Garrett and the fate of his missing passengers. Hidden in the rocks at the end of the canyon was not a spring, but an elaborate camp that had been carefully concealed to be invisible from the main trail. The camp contained comfortable sleeping areas, cooking facilities, and storage spaces that were stocked with supplies for extended stays. Most remarkably, the camp was occupied by more than 30 people who greeted Samuel and his passengers like old friends reuniting after a long separation. Cain immediately recognized several of the people in the camp as passengers who had been reported missing from Samuel's previous runs. The young woman who had supposedly disappeared 3 weeks earlier was tending a cooking fire. The elderly businessman who had vanished the month before was helping to care for horses that were grazing in a hidden meadow. Children who had been traveling with their families when they disappeared were playing games with other children whose parents had also vanished from Samuel's stagecoach. But what shocked Cain the most was the realization that none of these people were being held against their will. They weren't prisoners or victims. They were refugees who had voluntarily chosen to disappear from their old lives and start over in this hidden sanctuary that Samuel had created and maintained for people who desperately needed to escape from situations that threatened their safety or freedom. Samuel's missing passengers were escaped slaves who had been fleeing to freedom in Mexico. They were women who had been running from abusive husbands or fathers. They were men who had been marked for death by criminal organizations or corrupt officials. They were families who had been threatened with violence because of their political beliefs or religious practices. They were people who had needed to disappear completely from their old identities in order to survive. The hidden camp was actually a sophisticated way station for the Underground Railroad and other refugee assistance networks that were helping people escape from various forms of persecution and danger. Samuel's stagecoach route provided perfect cover for moving refugees through Colorado territory because his regular schedule and legitimate business meant that his movements wouldn't attract suspicion from law enforcement or criminal organizations. The system that Samuel had developed was ingenious in its simplicity and effectiveness. Refugees who needed to disappear would purchase tickets for a stagecoach under false names or with forged documents. During the journey, Samuel would guide them to the hidden camp where they could rest, recover from their ordeal, and prepare for the next stage of their escape to safety. The camp was equipped to house refugees for weeks or months while arrangements were made for their permanent relocation. Some refugees would eventually continue south to Mexico, where slavery was illegal and American law enforcement had no jurisdiction. Others would be provided with new identities and transportation to communities in Canada or the northern United States, where they could start over without fear of being discovered. Samuel's operation was supported by a network of allies throughout Colorado territory who provided funding, supplies, and intelligence about law enforcement activities that might threaten the refugees' safety. Way station operators along his route were secretly part of the network, providing cover for Samuel's route changes and ensuring that his activities wouldn't be reported to authorities. The refugees in the camp had organized themselves into a functioning community with shared responsibilities for cooking, childcare, security, and maintenance of their hidden sanctuary. They had developed systems for education, medical care, and conflict resolution that allowed people from diverse backgrounds to live together harmoniously while preparing for uncertain futures. Cain's discovery of Samuel's refugee camp put him in an impossible position. As a federal marshal, he was legally obligated to arrest Samuel for interfering with the capture of escaped slaves and for other violations of federal law. But as a human being, Cain was deeply moved by the stories of suffering and courage that he heard from the refugees who had found safety in Samuel's hidden sanctuary. The moral complexity of Cain's situation was further complicated by his growing understanding of the legal and political forces that had created the need for Samuel's operation. Many of the refugees in the camp were fleeing not just from individual persecution, but from systematic injustices that were supported by federal and territorial laws that Cain was sworn to uphold. Cain spent 3 days in the hidden camp, interviewing refugees and learning about the network that had brought them to safety. He heard stories of families torn apart by slavery, women beaten nearly to death by husbands who faced no legal consequences, and men targeted for murder because they had witnessed crimes committed by powerful officials. He met children who had been born to slavery, but who now had the chance to grow up free, and elderly people who had thought they would die in bondage, but who had found hope in their final years. The refugees treated Cain with respect but caution, understanding that his official position made him potentially dangerous to their safety. But Samuel encouraged them to share their stories with the federal marshal, believing that Cain needed to understand the human cost of the laws and policies that created the need for underground rescue operations. Cain's decision about what to do with his discovery was influenced by a conversation he had with an elderly former slave named Moses, who had escaped from a Louisiana plantation with his granddaughter after his son had been murdered for trying to protect his family from a brutal overseer. Moses explained to Cain that Samuel's operation was not about breaking the law for its own sake, but about choosing between man-made laws and higher moral principles when the two came into conflict. He argued that sometimes the most patriotic act was to disobey unjust laws in service of the values that the country claimed to represent. Cain wrestled with his conscience for 2 days before making a decision that would define the rest of his career and potentially change the lives of everyone in the hidden camp. Rather than arresting Samuel and exposing the refugee network, Cain chose to become part of the operation himself. Cain's decision was based on his conclusion that the refugees in Samuel's camp were not criminals who deserve punishment, but victims who deserve protection. He realized that his oath as a federal marshal required him to serve justice, and that true justice sometimes meant protecting innocent people from unjust laws rather than enforcing those laws blindly. But Cain's conversion from investigator to ally created new challenges for Samuel's operation. Federal authorities would expect Cain to report on his investigation, and his failure to arrest Samuel or expose the refugee camp would eventually attract suspicion from his superiors. Cain's solution was to file a report claiming that his investigation had found no evidence of criminal activity in connection with Samuel's missing passengers. He stated that the passengers had voluntarily left the stagecoach at various way stations and had continued their journeys by other means, exactly as Samuel had always claimed. To support his false report, Cain recruited several of the way station operators who were already part of Samuel's network to provide testimony backing up his conclusions. These operators agreed to sign statements confirming that they had seen passengers leave Samuel's stagecoach and arrange alternative transportation to their destinations. Cain's report was accepted by his superiors, but he knew that the reprieve was only temporary. Federal interest in transportation crimes was increasing, and more sophisticated investigations would eventually expose Samuel's operation unless the network could adapt to changing law enforcement techniques. Working with Samuel and the refugee network's leadership, Cain helped develop new methods for moving people to safety that would be less vulnerable to detection by federal investigators. They established multiple routes through different territories, diversified their transportation methods to include freight wagons and cattle drives, and created more sophisticated communication systems for coordinating refugee movements. Most importantly, Cain used his position as a federal marshal to provide early warning about law enforcement activities that might threaten the network's operations. He shared information about planned raids, new investigation techniques, and changes in federal policy that could affect refugee assistance activities. For 2 years, the enhanced network that Cain helped create operated successfully, moving hundreds of refugees to safety while avoiding detection by federal authorities. Samuel continued driving his stagecoach route, but his passengers now included federal marshals and other law enforcement officers who were secretly part of the refugee assistance network. The crisis that would ultimately expose the entire operation began when a new federal administrator was appointed to oversee law enforcement activities in Colorado Territory. Administrator Charles Morrison was a career bureaucrat who specialized in rooting out corruption and inefficiency in federal agencies, and he was specifically tasked with improving the prosecution rate for crimes against interstate travelers. Morrison's review of Kane's investigation records revealed patterns that suggested possible misconduct or incompetence. He noticed that Kane's investigations consistently failed to result in arrests or prosecutions, despite the serious nature of the crimes being investigated. Most suspicious of all, Morrison discovered that Kane had never followed up on his investigation of Samuel Garrett's missing passengers, despite the fact that new disappearances were continuing to occur. Morrison ordered a new investigation of Samuel's operation, led by a team of federal agents who had no previous connection to Colorado territory and who would be immune to any local influences that might have compromised Kane's work. The investigation team was headed by Agent William Bradford, a specialist in transportation crimes who had successfully prosecuted several major cases involving corrupt stagecoach drivers and freight operators. Bradford's investigation used techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything Kane had employed. Rather than simply following Samuel's stagecoach route, Bradford's team conducted surveillance of the entire transportation network in Colorado territory, looking for patterns of movement that might reveal hidden refugee activities. The investigation team also employed informants who posed as refugees seeking assistance, hoping to penetrate the network from within and gather evidence of illegal activities. These informants were trained to create convincing backgrounds as escaped slaves or victims of domestic violence, and they carried forged documents that would make them appear to be legitimate candidates for refugee assistance. Bradford's breakthrough came when one of his informants successfully gained access to Samuel's hidden camp and was able to provide detailed information about its location, organization, and population. The informant's report confirmed that Samuel was operating a major refugee assistance network and that federal law enforcement officers were complicit in protecting the operation. Armed with comprehensive intelligence about Samuel's network, Bradford planned a coordinated raid that would capture Samuel, arrest the refugees in the hidden camp, and expose the federal officers who had been protecting the operation. The raid was scheduled for a Thursday morning when Samuel would be returning from Santa Fe with a new group of refugees who could be arrested and prosecuted as evidence of ongoing criminal activities. But Bradford's plans were discovered by Kane, who had maintained contacts within federal law enforcement agencies that allowed him to monitor investigations that might threaten the refugee network. Kane learned about the planned raid 3 days before it was scheduled to take place, giving him just enough time to warn Samuel and coordinate an emergency evacuation of the hidden camp. The warning came too late to prevent the raid entirely, but it allowed Samuel and his allies to prepare for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the refugee network and everyone who had been part of it. Samuel faced a choice between surrendering to federal authorities and fighting back against agents who were trying to destroy an operation that had saved hundreds of lives. Samuel's decision was influenced by his knowledge that surrender would not only end his own freedom, but would also result in the capture and prosecution of refugees who had risked everything to escape from slavery and other forms of persecution. He chose to make a stand at Devil's Canyon, the narrow passage where his hidden camp was located, hoping to delay the federal agents long enough for the refugees to escape to safety. The gunfight that took place in Devil's Canyon on that Thursday morning became legendary throughout Colorado territory, not just for its violence, but for the principles that motivated it. Samuel and Kane fought alongside refugees who had found freedom through the Stagecoach network, defending their hidden sanctuary against federal agents who were trying to enforce laws that many Americans had come to view as fundamentally unjust. The battle lasted for more than 6 hours, with Samuel's group using their knowledge of the canyon's terrain to hold off a much larger force of federal agents. But the outcome was never really in doubt. Bradford's team had superior numbers, better weapons, and the resources of the federal government behind them. When the gunfire finally ended, Samuel Garrett lay dead among the rocks of Devil's Canyon, his body shielding the entrance to the camp that had been his life's work. Kane was mortally wounded, but lived long enough to see that most of the refugees had successfully escaped through hidden trails that led deep into the mountains where federal agents couldn't follow them. Bradford's raid captured only a handful of refugees and failed to locate the extensive supply caches and communication networks that had supported Samuel's operation. Most importantly, the raid created a public relations disaster for federal authorities when newspapers throughout the territory reported that federal agents had killed a stagecoach driver and several refugees who had been seeking freedom from slavery and domestic violence. The story of Samuel Garrett's last stand inspired a wave of public sympathy for refugee assistance networks and contributed to growing opposition to federal policies that criminalized efforts to help escape slaves and other victims of persecution. Samuel's death became a symbol of the moral courage required to resist unjust laws, and his sacrifice inspired others to continue the work he had begun. The hidden camp in Devil's Canyon was destroyed by federal agents, but the network that Samuel had created survived and expanded. Other drivers, freight operators, and transportation workers throughout the territory began providing similar services for refugees, using techniques and routes that Samuel and Kane had developed. The refugees who escaped from Devil's Canyon during the final raid eventually reached safety in Mexico, Canada, and communities throughout the northern United States where they could start new lives without fear of recapture. Many of them established their own refugee assistance networks, ensuring that Samuel's work would continue for generations. Samuel's modified stagecoach was confiscated by federal authorities and studied as evidence of the sophistication of refugee assistance networks. But investigators never discovered all of the hidden compartments and secret features that Samuel had built into the vehicle, and many of his innovations were later adopted by other transportation networks. The official federal report on Samuel's operation portrayed him as a criminal who had interfered with legitimate law enforcement activities and who had deserved the fate he received. But the people of Colorado Territory remembered Samuel Garrett as a hero who had sacrificed his life to protect innocent people from unjust persecution. Years later, when slavery was abolished and the moral principles that had motivated Samuel's work were finally enshrined in law, a monument was erected at Devil's Canyon honoring the stagecoach driver who had always arrived empty because he had been delivering his passengers to freedom instead of to their stated destinations. The inscription on Samuel's monument reads simply, "He lost every passenger and saved every soul." But those words only hint at the remarkable story of a man who had transformed apparent failure into the greatest success possible, the preservation of human dignity and freedom in the face of systematic oppression. Samuel Garrett had indeed been the most unreliable stagecoach driver in Colorado Territory, but only because he had been serving a higher purpose than simply transporting passengers from one town to another. His empty stagecoach had been full of hope, courage, and the promise that freedom was always possible for those brave enough to seek it and compassionate enough to help others find it. The stagecoach driver who always arrived empty had actually been delivering the most precious cargo of all, human beings to their freedom. And his legacy lived on in every person who chose to risk their safety to help others escape from oppression and find new hope in an uncertain world.